You're settling in now. Maybe it's late where you are, or maybe you're just winding down after a long day. Welcome to Tales of Vatican Secrets. If you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe. You'll want to be here when the next story drops. I'm curious, which country are you listening from right now? And what time is it there? Tonight, we're not chasing shadows or rumors. We're walking through real documents, real decisions, real systems that shaped what gets remembered and what gets quietly set aside. This isn't about sensational mysteries. It's about the mechanics of silence. How one item can vanish from an inventory not because it was destroyed, but because someone decided it didn't need to be listed anymore. Once you understand how that works, you can't unknow it. So if you're ready to see how institutional memory actually functions, stay with me. Because what we're about to examine isn't hidden in darkness, it's hidden in plain process. You're standing at the threshold of understanding something most people never think to question. How does an institution decide what counts as worth remembering? Not in theory, not in philosophy, but in the actual daily mechanics of cataloging, shelving, and recording. The Vatican Secret Archives, officially renamed the Vatican Apostolic Archives in 2019, though the old name still clings to it in most conversations, operates under a system that was radically reorganized during the pontificate of Leo XIII, who in 1881 issued a decree opening portions of the archives to qualified scholars for the first time in modern history. Before that moment, access was so restricted that even the concept of an inventory was more myth than reality to outsiders. But Leo XIII's decision wasn't about transparency in the way we'd understand it today. It was about control through revelation, deciding that letting certain documents be seen by certain people under certain conditions would actually strengthen the Church's position rather than weaken it. The physical location of these archives matters because it explains how things can go missing without anyone breaking in. The main repository sits in a section of the Vatican called the Cortile del Belvedere, tucked into a series of climate-controlled rooms that span multiple floors. But there are also satellite storage areas scattered throughout Vatican City, some in basements beneath administrative buildings, others in tower rooms that most employees have never entered. The catalog system itself was standardized in phases throughout the 20th century, but it relies on a classification method that predates modern archival science. Documents are grouped not just by date or subject, but by the office that created them, which means that a single event might be documented in 5 different places, depending on which cardinal, which secretary, which tribunal was involved. This isn't a flaw in the system, it's the system, and it means that knowing a document exists is not the same as knowing where it's filed, and knowing where it's filed is not the same as knowing which inventory list includes it. Now, here's where it gets specific. In 1998, a research team led by a German historian named Hubert Wolff was granted access to files related to the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, formerly the Supreme Sacred Congregation of the Roman and Universal Inquisition, and they discovered something odd. There was a reference in a 16th century procedural memo to a registro del sentenze revocate, a register of revoked sentences, meaning cases where the Inquisition had initially condemned someone, but later quietly reversed its decision. The memo didn't describe the contents of this register in detail, but it mentioned a specific shelf notation, Armadio 6, Palchetto C, Fascicolo 12. When Wolff's team requested access to that exact location, they were told the materials had been moved during a reorganization in 1965, part of the post-Vatican II archival reforms, and that the current location was being verified. That verification never came. Instead, they were offered access to a different set of Inquisition files, ones that had already been studied by other scholars. The consequence of this wasn't dramatic. No one held a press conference. No scandal erupted. But the research team noted in their published work that they had been unable to confirm whether the register still existed, and that citation became a footnote that other historians would reference when discussing the limits of archival access. This is how things vanish in an institution like the Vatican, not through fire or theft, but through administrative reorganization, through the quiet decision that certain materials are not priority items for cataloging, through the simple reality that if no one knows exactly where something is, it effectively doesn't exist for research purposes. The physical reality of the Vatican archives makes this easier than you'd think. Unlike a modern library where everything is bar-coded and digitally tracked, much of the Vatican's collection still relies on handwritten ledgers, some updated regularly, others not touched since the 1950s. There are entire rooms where the only way to know what's on a particular shelf is to physically go there and look, and access to those rooms is restricted to a small number of archival staff who work on rotations that change every few years, meaning institutional knowledge about where things actually are gets lost with each personnel shift. Some historians quietly disagree about whether this is intentional or simply the result of an overwhelmed system managing centuries of accumulated paper. The archives contain an estimated 53 linear miles of shelving, and while that figure gets repeated often, it's worth understanding what it actually means in practice. It means that even if you had unlimited access and unlimited time, you could not physically examine everything. It means that the curators themselves often don't know what's in certain collections until someone requests it, and they have to go looking. It means that the inventory lists, which are supposed to be comprehensive guides to holdings, are themselves incomplete, sometimes listing materials that have been moved or misfiled, sometimes omitting materials that exist but were never formally cataloged. The specific mechanism that governs this is called the fondo system. Each fondo is essentially a collection of documents from a particular office or period, and each fondo has its own inventory, but there's no master index that cross-references all the fondi. So if a document was created by the Secretariat of State but later transferred to the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, it might appear in one inventory, both inventories, or neither, depending on whether the transfer was officially recorded. This isn't an accident. It's a feature of a system designed in an era when the idea of total transparency would have seemed absurd, even dangerous. The Church operated for centuries on the principle that information was a resource to be managed, not a right to be granted, and the structures built to house and organize that information reflect that principle at every level. Now, the item that concerns us tonight, the thing that's missing from the inventory list, isn't the register of revoked sentences, though that's related. It's something smaller, more specific, and in some ways more telling. In 1633, the Inquisition concluded its trial of Galileo Galilei, and the documents from that trial, the interrogation transcripts, the theological assessments, the final sentence, are all preserved and have been studied extensively. They're part of a fondo called Decreta Cento Officio, and they're listed in the inventory with clear shelf notations. But there's a document referenced in the trial proceedings that has never been located, a letter from Galileo to the Inquisition written in 1615, in which he apparently offered to recant certain statements from his earlier work if it would prevent a formal investigation. The existence of this letter is confirmed by a response letter from Cardinal Robert Bellarmine, which is in the archives and has been examined by multiple scholars. Bellarmine's letter references specific phrases from Galileo's letter and even quotes a sentence directly. "If my words have given offense to the faith, I withdraw them without reservation." But Galileo's original letter is not in the Galileo file. It's not in the Bellarmine papers. It's not listed in any inventory of Inquisition correspondence from that period. And yet we know it existed because Bellarmine responded to it, because the trial records mention it in passing, because later historians writing in the 18th century referred to it as evidence of Galileo's early attempts to avoid condemnation. So where is it? The most likely explanation is that it was misfiled during one of the many reorganizations of the Inquisition archives, possibly removed from the Galileo file, because someone thought it belonged in a general correspondence file. possibly placed in a collection of letters to Bellarmine that was later dispersed when his personal papers were distributed among different repositories. But there's another possibility that historians discuss less openly, that the letter was deliberately removed from the inventory because it complicated the narrative that the Church wanted to preserve. If Galileo had attempted to recant in 1615, 18 years before his trial, it meant that the Inquisition had continued to pursue him even after he'd expressed willingness to submit to church authority. That doesn't fit neatly into the story of a proud scientist who refused to compromise with religious orthodoxy, nor does it fit into the story of a church simply defending its doctrine against a dangerous innovator. It's messier than either version, and mess is exactly what institutional archives are designed to smooth over. The consequence of this specific absence is that every biography of Galileo, every history of the trial, every analysis of the relationship between science and religion in the 17th century is working from an incomplete record. Not because the information is lost, but because it's not listed, not cataloged, not accessible through the normal channels that researchers use. And that distinction matters. You're beginning to see how this works now, how absence functions as a kind of presence, how the decision not to list something is itself a form of documentation. The Vatican archives operate under a set of access rules that were most recently updated in 2006 when Benedict XVI issued a directive expanding researcher access to materials up through the pontificate of Pius V, who died in 1939. Before that, the cutoff was 1922, which meant that anything related to World War I, the rise of fascism, the early years of Soviet communism, was off limits. The 2006 opening was significant, but it came with a caveat that most news reports at the time didn't emphasize. The expanded access applied only to materials that had already been cataloged and inventoried. Uncatalogued materials, even from the newly opened period, remained restricted pending archival processing, a phrase that has no fixed timeline and no external oversight. This is the institutional mechanism that allows things to remain effectively hidden without anyone having to actively hide them. If a document hasn't been formally inventoried, it doesn't legally exist for access purposes, and the decision about when to complete that inventory rests entirely with the archival staff. Now, there's a physical space where much of this uncatalogued material sits, and it's worth describing because it explains why the process moves so slowly. In the lowest level of the archives, beneath the main reading rooms, there's a section known informally as the Deposito non ordinato, the unorganized deposit. It's not a secret location. Archival staff refer to it openly in internal documents. But it's not a space that researchers ever see. The materials here aren't ancient parchments or medieval manuscripts. They're mostly 20th century files, typewritten correspondence, carbon copy memos, reports from papal nuncios, diplomatic cables, internal assessments from various congregations. They're organized only in the most basic sense, grouped by rough date ranges and stored in industrial shelving units, the kind you'd see in any large institution's basement storage. Some of these files have been down there since they were first transferred from active office use in the 1950s and 1960s. Some arrived more recently, moved out of working offices to make room for new materials. The key point is that being in this space means being outside the official catalog system, which means being outside the scope of researcher requests. When Benedict XVI opened materials up to 1939, he was opening access to inventoried materials from that period. But the Deposito non ordinato contains thousands of files from before 1939 that still haven't been processed. The consequence is a kind of archival limbo, documents that are neither secret nor accessible, neither lost nor findable. And within that space, somewhere in those industrial shelves, there's almost certainly a box containing the Galileo letter or other items like it. Materials that were removed from formal collections during various reorganizations and placed in temporary storage that became permanent. The cataloging rule that governs this situation dates back to a reform implemented in 1924 under Pius V, who created a new position called the Prefect of the Vatican Secret Archives and gave that office authority to establish standardized procedures for accessioning and cataloging. The rule that matters most here is called priorita documentaria, documentary priority, which means that when archival staff have limited time and resources, they focus first on materials that support current institutional needs, documents required for ongoing legal cases, historical materials needed for beatification investigations, correspondence relevant to diplomatic relations. Everything else gets cataloged eventually, in theory, but eventually can mean decades. This isn't unique to the Vatican. Most large archives operate with backlogs, but the Vatican's backlog has an unusual characteristic: no external pressure to clear it. A state archive might face public criticism or legislative oversight if important historical materials remain uncatalogued for too long. A university archive might lose funding or accreditation. The Vatican archives answer only to the Holy See, and the Holy See has no incentive to rush the processing of materials that might complicate its institutional narrative. Now, let's anchor this to something verifiable. In 2002, a scholar named Giovanni Cocco published an article in the journal Rivista di Storia della Chiesa in Italia, documenting his attempts to access files related to the Vatican's diplomatic relations with Mussolini's government in the 1930s. Cocco had been granted access to the Fondo of the Secretariat of State for that period, which had been officially opened, but he kept finding references in those documents to attachments, supporting memos and background reports that were supposedly filed in a separate collection called Affari Straordinari, Extraordinary Affairs. When he requested access to those materials, he was told they were still being inventoried. He filed multiple requests over 3 years, each time receiving the same response. Finally, in 2005, after Benedict's expanded access decree, he was given partial access to the Affari Straordinari Fondo, but the specific files he'd been requesting were not included. They were, he was told, in restoration, which typically means they're too fragile to be handled. But Cocco noted in his published work that he'd never been given an estimate of when the restoration would be complete or whether the documents would be digitized for access. The consequence of this specific restriction was that his research on Vatican-Mussolini relations had to proceed without key documents that he knew existed, that were referenced in other files, but that he could not examine. His work is still considered authoritative because he documented the gaps thoroughly, but it remains incomplete by design. Some historians quietly disagree about whether these access restrictions are primarily about protecting fragile documents or about controlling information. The physical reality of archival restoration supports both interpretations. Many documents from that period are genuinely fragile, written on acidic paper that's deteriorating, stored in conditions that weren't climate-controlled for decades. But restoration is also a convenient category for indefinite delay, because there's no external standard for when something is restored enough to be accessed. The Vatican could, theoretically, keep documents in restoration status indefinitely, moving them occasionally to new conservation housing while never making them available for research. Whether this happens deliberately or simply as a side effect of limited resources is impossible to prove without insider knowledge that no outsider has. The item missing from our inventory, the Galileo letter, likely falls into this same category. If it exists in the deposito non ordinato or in a restoration queue, it's not deliberately hidden in the sense of being locked in a vault that no one can enter. It's hidden by being unprocessed, uncatalogued, and therefore unlocatable except by chance or by someone who already knows exactly where it is. And that's a more effective form of concealment than any lock or seal, because it doesn't require ongoing secrecy, it just requires inaction. The system maintains itself through its own inertia, through the accumulated weight of centuries of material that no one has time or incentive to fully organize. And every few decades, when external pressure builds, when historians publish articles about gaps in the record, when journalists write stories about Vatican secrecy, when scholars petition for expanded access, the Church opens another 10 or 20 years of material, releases a new set of inventories, and the conversation shifts to celebrating transparency rather than questioning what remains unprocessed. This happened in 1881 with Leo III, again in 1924 with Pius V, again in 1978 under John Paul II, again in 2006 under Benedict XVI, and most recently in 2020 when Francis opened materials from the pontificate of Pius V, covering World War II and the Holocaust. Each opening is real, each represents genuine expansion of access, but each also resets the clock on questions about what's still waiting to be cataloged. The physical mechanism that enables this is surprisingly mundane. When a new period is open for research, archival staff spend months or years beforehand preparing inventories, digitizing finding aids, organizing materials into accessible collections. But they're preparing only the materials that are already in the formal catalog system. The Deposito non ordinato stays untouched because it's technically not part of any pontificate's official records. It's transitional material, still being processed, still in administrative limbo. And so the system perpetuates itself. Each opening creates the appearance of completeness, while the unprocessed backlog grows larger with each decade's accumulation of new materials. The consequence for historical understanding is profound, but hard to measure. We know what we can study. We can identify some of what we can't. But we have no systematic way of knowing what exists in that middle category. Materials that are physically present, institutionally acknowledged, but practically inaccessible. The Galileo letter is one item in that category. There are almost certainly thousands of others, documents that would reshape our understanding of specific events, decisions, relationships, but that remain out of reach not because anyone is actively concealing them, but because the system is designed to move slowly and no one with power has a reason to speed it up. You're deeper into this now, past the point where you can pretend that archival practice is neutral or that access is just a matter of paperwork and patience. Let's talk about a specific physical location that makes the absence of items like the Galileo letter more concrete. There's a room in the Vatican archives called the Sala degli Indici, the index room, and it's where researchers go to consult the finding aids and inventories before requesting specific documents. The room itself was renovated in 1985, fitted with modern shelving and better lighting, but the indices it contains are a mix of old and new, some handwritten ledgers dating back to the 19th century, others typed catalog cards from the mid-20th century, and a growing number of digitized records accessible through computer terminals. What's significant about this room is what's not in it. There's no comprehensive master index of everything the archives contain. Instead, there are indexes for specific fondi, and you have to know which fondo might contain what you're looking for before you can even begin searching. This means that if the Galileo letter was misfiled into a fondo that has no obvious connection to the Inquisition or to Galileo himself, say, a general correspondence file from the Secretariat of State, or a collection of letters addressed to Cardinal Bellarmine that never got cross-referenced with the Galileo materials, then there's no systematic way for a researcher to find it without already knowing it's there. The cataloging rule that creates this situation is called rispetto del fondo, respect for the fonds, and it's a principle borrowed from French archival theory in the 19th century. It means that documents are kept grouped by their office of origin rather than being reorganized by subject. The logic is that this preserves the original context of how documents were created and used, which is valuable for understanding bureaucratic processes. But the practical effect is that researching a single topic often requires consulting multiple fondi, each with its own inventory, and if a document relevant to your topic happens to be filed in a fondo you didn't think to check, you'll never find it. Now, in 1998, the same year that Hubert Wolff's team discovered the reference to the Register of Revoked Inquisition sentences, another researcher named Peter Godman was working in the archives on a project about the Index of Forbidden Books. Godman had been granted access to the fondo of the Congregation of the Index, which operated from 1571 until 1917, when it was merged into the Congregation of the Holy Office. He was looking for correspondence related to how books were evaluated and censored, and he found extensive files documenting the process: readers' reports, theological assessments, letters from authors petitioning to have their works removed from the index. But he kept finding references to a separate category of materials called libri reservati, reserved books, which were apparently works that had been suppressed but not formally listed on the public index. The references suggested that these books were kept in a separate archive, possibly in the Vatican Library, rather than the secret archives, and that access to information about them was restricted even within the church hierarchy. When Godman requested information about this collection, he was told that the Libri Reservati were not part of the Congregation of the Index Fondo, and that he would need to submit a separate request. He did so, and was informed that materials related to reserved books were still being evaluated for access and that no timeline could be provided. This detail appears in his book, The Saint as Censor, published in 2000, where he notes that his research was limited by the unavailability of these materials and that future scholars might be able to provide a more complete picture if access policies changed. The consequence of this restriction is that we have detailed knowledge of how the Church's public censorship system worked, which books were banned, who made the decisions, what theological or political factors influenced those decisions, but we have almost no systematic knowledge of the private censorship system, the books that were suppressed without announcement, the works that church officials deemed too dangerous even to publicly condemn. Some historians quietly disagree about whether this two-tier system was extensive or limited to a small number of extreme cases. Without access to the Libri Reservati files, there's no way to settle the question definitively. And that's precisely the point. The absence of information from the inventory creates an ongoing debate that can never be resolved, which serves the institution's interests more effectively than either confirming or denying the scale of private censorship. The historical anchor for understanding why this system existed comes from the Council of Trent, which concluded in 1563 and established many of the administrative structures that still shape how the Vatican operates. One of Trent's decrees mandated that bishops submit regular reports to Rome about potential heresy in their dioceses, and that these reports should include not just public preaching or published works, but also private manuscripts, personal correspondence, and unpublished writings that might spread dangerous ideas. This created a massive influx of material to Rome, much of it never intended for publication, and the question arose, what do you do with a private letter that contains heretical ideas but was never widely circulated? Putting it on the public index would draw attention to ideas that might otherwise remain obscure. Destroying it would eliminate potential evidence in future proceedings. The solution was to create a category of reserved materials kept in separate files, accessible only to specific officials who needed to review them for theological or legal purposes. Over time, this became a distinct archival category, and like all such categories, it developed its own bureaucratic rules, its own access restrictions, its own inventory system, or in this case, its own lack of a public inventory. The physical reality of where these materials are kept is less clear than with the main archives. The Vatican Library, which is a separate institution from the Vatican Archives, has a section called the Biblioteca Riservata, the reserved library, but it's not clear whether the Libri Riservati from the Congregation of the Index were transferred there, or whether they remain in some subsection of the archives. What is clear is that they're not cataloged in any finding aid available to researchers, which means they're effectively invisible unless you already know to ask about them and can make a case for why you specifically need access. And even then, as Godman discovered, the answer is likely to be no, or at least not yet. The institutional mechanism that supports this is a classification system implemented in 1934 under a reform of the Archives' access policies. Materials were divided into 3 categories: aperta, open, riservata, reserved, and segreta, secret. The open materials could be accessed by any qualified scholar. The reserved materials required special permission and a specific research justification. The secret materials were closed to all outside researchers. Over time, the secret category has shrunk. Many materials once classified as secret have been reclassified as reserved or open. But the reserved category has grown, absorbing materials that are technically not secret, but that the Church prefers to control access to. The Libri Reservati files, if they exist as a distinct collection, are almost certainly in this reserved category, which means they're not forbidden, but they're not available, and the decision about whether to grant access is made case by case with no published criteria and no appeals process. Now, here's where the Galileo letter connects to this broader pattern. If that letter contained Galileo's offer to recant statements that the Church hadn't yet publicly challenged, it would have been exactly the kind of document that might be moved into a reserved category. Not because it proved anything scandalous, but because it complicated the historical narrative that the Church wanted to preserve, that Galileo was investigated only after he publicly promoted Copernican theory and that he was condemned only after refusing to submit to Church authority. A letter showing that he'd tried to submit preemptively and that the Church had proceeded with investigation anyway would suggest that the trial was about asserting institutional control rather than defending doctrinal truth. That's not a revelation that would shock anyone familiar with how institutions operate, but it's the kind of nuance that institutions prefer to leave ambiguous. So the letter, if it was found during a reorganization of the Inquisition files, might have been transferred to a reserved collection, cataloged under a generic heading like Correspondence Regarding Cosmological Disputes, and effectively removed from the Galileo narrative. It would still exist. It would still be in the Vatican's possession, but it would no longer be part of the story that researchers could access and include in their work. The consequence of this possibility, and it's only a possibility, not a confirmed fact, is that every account of the Galileo trial is working from a curated version of the archival record, one where the most complicating details have been quietly set aside. And this isn't unique to Galileo. It's a pattern that repeats across hundreds of years and thousands of cases. The archives preserve an official version of events supported by carefully cataloged documents, while the unofficial version, the version that doesn't fit the preferred narrative, sits somewhere in the deposito non ordinato, or the reserved collections, technically preserved but practically erased from historical memory. Some historians quietly disagree about whether this represents deliberate institutional manipulation or simply the natural outcome of any large organization managing information over centuries. The truth is probably both. The system wasn't designed with the specific goal of hiding the Galileo letter, but it was designed with the general goal of maintaining institutional control over its historical narrative. And individual documents, like the Galileo letter, get caught in that system not through conspiracy, but through the consistent application of bureaucratic rules that prioritize certain kinds of preservation and access over others. And that's a more sustainable form of information control than any active cover-up, because it doesn't require ongoing effort or secrecy. It just requires maintaining the system as it is, cataloging what serves institutional interests, postponing what doesn't, and waiting for historians to work with whatever materials are made available to them. You're at the point now where the mechanics of institutional memory become visible in their details, where you can see not just that things go missing, but exactly how the system enables their absence. Let's talk about a specific procedural reform that changed how the Vatican archives categorize materials, because it's in these technical administrative changes that the real work of shaping history happens. In 1969, during the pontificate of Paul VI, the archives underwent what was called the Riordinamento Post-Conciliare, the post-conciliar reorganization, a response to the Second Vatican Council's emphasis on modernization and transparency. The reform had several practical goals: standardizing catalog formats across different fondi, improving climate control and preservation conditions, and creating clearer access procedures for researchers. But it also included a less publicized element: the transfer of what were called materiali sensibili, sensitive materials, from general fondi into specialized restricted collections. The criteria for what counted as sensitive was never published in detail, but internal memos from that period, some of which have since been accessed by researchers studying the archive's own history, indicate that the category included materials related to ongoing diplomatic situations, documents that might affect living persons' reputations, and files containing theological disputes that remained unresolved. The physical process of this reorganization involved teams of archival staff going through existing fondi, identifying materials that met the sensitivity criteria, and physically moving them to a new location. That location was described in one memo as depositi controllati, controlled deposits, which appears to be an early name for what later became the reserved collections. The problem with this process, from a historical research perspective, is that the materials were removed from their original archival context, taken out of the fondi where they'd been naturally filed as part of the bureaucratic process that created them, and placed in new collections, organized by sensitivity level rather than by origin or subject. This breaks the principle of rispetto del fondo that's supposed to govern archival practice, but it was justified as necessary for protecting the Church's interests during a period of intense public scrutiny following the Council. The consequence of the 1969 reorganization was that materials that had once been part of accessible fondi became part of restricted collections, and the inventories were updated to reflect the removal, but not always the destination. So, a researcher consulting an inventory might see a notation like Documenti 145, 167 trasferiti, documents 145 through 167 transferred, with no indication of where they were transferred to or under what conditions they might be accessed. This happened extensively in the fondi related to the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, which, during the council period, was undergoing its own reforms and wanted to distance itself from its historical role as the Inquisition. Documents related to historical trials, censorship decisions, and theological investigations were reviewed, and many were transferred to controlled deposits. The Galileo letter, if it was in the main Inquisition fondo before 1969, could easily have been moved during this reorganization. It would have met the criteria for sensitive material. It related to a historical controversy that still generated public discussion. It involved questions about the Church's treatment of scientific inquiry, and it contained details that complicated the official narrative of the Galileo trial. A transfer notation would have been added to the inventory. Material trasferito, 1969, but with no specifics about where it went or how to request access to it. And because the reorganization affected thousands of documents across dozens of fondi, there was no comprehensive list of what had been moved where. The system that was supposed to create order actually created a more sophisticated form of disorder. One where things weren't lost, but were relocated beyond the reach of normal research methods. Now, let's anchor this to a verifiable historical situation that demonstrates the pattern. In 1979, a British historian named John Cornwell was researching Pius XV's actions during World War II, specifically his decisions about whether to publicly condemn Nazi persecution of Jews. Cornwell had been granted limited access to some diplomatic correspondence from the pontificate, but he kept finding references to a series of meetings in 1942 between Pius X and German bishops who had visited Rome to discuss the situation in Germany. The meeting minutes were referenced in multiple documents, described as verbali riservati, reserved minutes, kept separately from regular diplomatic files. When Cornwell requested access to these minutes, he was told they had been moved during the 1969 reorganization and that their current location was being determined. He never received access during his initial research period, which ended in 1981. The book he published in 1999, Hitler's Pope, was criticized for being incomplete on this specific point, and Cornwell himself acknowledged in later interviews that his conclusions might have been different if he'd been able to access those meeting minutes. They were finally opened to researchers in 2020 as part of the general opening of Pius X materials 41 years after Cornwell first requested them. When scholars were able to examine them, they found that the minutes contained extensive discussions of what the Vatican knew about concentration camps and what options Pius X had for responding, details that would have significantly enriched the historical debate decades earlier. Some historians quietly disagree about whether the delay in accessing these minutes was necessary for diplomatic reasons, whether opening them earlier would have damaged the Church's relationships with post-war German governments, or whether it was primarily about controlling a sensitive narrative until enough time had passed that the revelations would have less contemporary political impact. What's not in dispute is that the 1969 reorganization created the mechanism by which those minutes could be moved out of accessible files and held in a restricted category for half a century, and that this was presented not as censorship but as proper archival management. The institutional mechanism that enabled this and that continues to shape what researchers can and cannot access is the role of the prefect of the Apostolic Archives, the person who has final authority over access decisions. This position was created in 1924, but its powers were expanded significantly in the 1969 reforms. The prefect is appointed directly by the Pope and serves at papal pleasure, which means the position is inherently tied to the institutional interests of the papacy rather than to external standards of archival practice or historical scholarship. The current prefect, as of the knowledge I can reliably access from early 2025, operates under guidelines that were most recently updated in 2005. Which state that access decisions should balance the needs of historical research with the protection of the Church's pastoral mission and diplomatic relations. That phrase, protection of the Church's pastoral mission, is broad enough to justify restricting access to almost anything that might embarrass the Church or complicate its contemporary message, and because the prefect's decisions are not subject to external review. There's no practical way for researchers to challenge a denial of access. The physical reality of how this works in practice involves a formal request process that researchers must follow. You submit a written application describing your research project, specify which fondi you want to access, and provide evidence of your scholarly credentials. The application goes to the prefect's office, where it's reviewed by a small staff of archivists who advise on whether the request should be granted. For materials in open fondi, this is usually straightforward. If you're a qualified researcher with a legitimate project, you get access. But for materials in reserved collections, or for requests that touch on sensitive topics, the review can take months, and the denial, if it comes, is typically phrased in terms of the materials not being fully cataloged yet, or still being in restoration, or being subject to diplomatic restrictions. There's rarely an explicit acknowledgement that the content of the materials is the reason for denial. Instead, the system generates procedural justifications that are technically accurate. The materials might genuinely need restoration, the catalog might genuinely be incomplete, but that function as indefinite postponements. The consequence for researchers is that you learn to work around these restrictions rather than challenging them directly. You focus on materials you can access. You acknowledge gaps in your work. You phrase your conclusions cautiously. And over time, the scholarship on topics like the Galileo trial or Pius XIV's wartime papacy comes to reflect not what the archives actually contain, but what researchers have been able to see, which means the historical narrative slowly conforms to the institution's preferred version not through falsification but through selective availability. The Galileo letter, if it's sitting in a reserved collection or in the Deposito non ordinato, represents one small piece of this larger pattern. Its absence from the accessible record doesn't change the basic facts of Galileo's trial, but it removes a complicating detail that would enrich our understanding of how the Inquisition operated, how Galileo tried to navigate institutional pressure, and how the conflict between religious authority and scientific inquiry actually unfolded in human terms rather than as a symbolic confrontation. And because the system that keeps it inaccessible operates through bureaucratic procedure rather than explicit censorship, there's no villain in this story, no conscious conspiracy, just an institutional structure that has evolved over centuries to protect its interests through the careful management of its own history. You're nearly at the end of this now, but there's one more layer to understand, one more mechanism by which institutional memory gets shaped in ways that most people never see. Let's talk about the relationship between the Vatican archives and the archives of specific religious orders, because this is where materials can disappear not through removal from the Vatican's collections, but through never arriving there in the first place. The Catholic Church operates through a complex network of organizations. The Vatican itself, various congregations and offices of the Holy See, diocesan archives spread across the world, and the archives of religious orders like the Jesuits, Dominicans, Franciscans, and dozens of others. Each of these entities maintains its own records, and there's no requirement that they transfer everything to the Vatican archives. In fact, many prefer to keep their institutional records within their own order's archives, where they have complete control over access and interpretation. This means that if you want to fully research a figure like Galileo, who had extensive contacts with Jesuits, you need to access not just the Vatican archives, but also the Jesuit archives, which are housed in Rome but are a separate institution with separate access policies. The historical anchor for this divided archival landscape goes back to the suppression and restoration of the Jesuit order. In 1773, under pressure from European monarchs, Pope Clement XIV issued a brief called Dominus Ac Redemptor that suppressed the Society of Jesus worldwide. The Jesuits' property was confiscated, their institutions closed, and their archives dispersed. When the order was restored in 1814 by Pius VII, the Jesuits began rebuilding their institutional infrastructure, including their archives. But many documents from the pre-suppression period had been lost or were scattered in various repositories. As they reconstructed their archives, they adopted a policy of keeping materials within the order's control rather than depositing them with the Vatican, a stance that reflected both practical necessity, they needed to rebuild institutional memory, and a degree of wariness about centralizing too much power in the Vatican after having experienced the consequences of papal hostility. This created an archival situation where materials related to many important historical events exist in multiple repositories, and where accessing the full record requires navigating multiple institutions with different access policies. The Galileo case is a perfect example. The Inquisition files are in the Vatican archives, but correspondence between Galileo and Jesuit astronomers, discussions within the Jesuit order about how to respond to his work, internal debates about the theological implications of Copernican theory, these materials would be in the Jesuit archives if they were preserved at all. And the Jesuit archives, while more accessible than they once were, still maintain their own restrictions, particularly on materials that touch on internal order politics or that might affect relationships with the Vatican. The physical location of the Jesuit archives is on Via dei Penitenziari in Rome, a 10-minute walk from St. Peter's, but institutionally separate. The cataloging system there is different from the Vatican's. The access procedures are different, and the staff operate under different principles about what should be open and what should remain restricted. A researcher working on Galileo would need to submit separate applications to both archives, and there's no guarantee that materials in one archive would be cross-referenced with materials in the other. So if the Galileo letter we've been discussing was actually correspondence to a Jesuit intermediary, rather than directly to the Inquisition, it might never have been in the Vatican archives at all. It might be in the Jesuit archives, cataloged under a completely different heading, accessible under different rules. Or it might be in both places, a copy sent to the Inquisition and filed there, the original kept by the Jesuits who were handling the communication, and the two copies might contain different details. One version edited or summarized by the intermediary who passed it along. The consequence of this divided archival landscape is that comprehensive historical research on many topics is impossible without access to multiple repositories. And even with access, there's no way to be certain you've found everything relevant because there's no master catalog of all Catholic Church documents. The system preserves institutional autonomy at the cost of historical completeness, and that trade-off is intentional. The Church's structure has always balanced central authority with subsidiary independence, and the archival system reflects that balance. Now, some historians quietly disagree about whether this fragmented approach to archives is primarily about institutional independence or about maintaining plausible deniability for sensitive materials. If a document is never transferred to the Vatican archives, the Vatican can honestly say it doesn't have it, even if the document exists in another Catholic archive that the Vatican could theoretically request access to. This isn't a conspiracy theory, it's a straightforward reading of how institutional boundaries function. Organizations protect themselves by separating knowledge and responsibility, and archives are one way that separation gets maintained over time. Let's anchor this to a specific case that demonstrates the pattern. In 1998, the Vatican issued a document called We Remember, a Reflection on the Shoah, which addressed the Catholic Church's response to the Holocaust. The document acknowledged that some Catholics, including clergy, had failed to do enough to help Jews during Nazi persecution, but it also stated that Pius XV had worked behind the scenes to save Jewish lives, and that research showed he had done more than was often recognized. Critics pointed out that the document's historical claims were based primarily on materials in the Vatican archives and didn't account for documents in other repositories, particularly diocesan archives in Germany and Poland, where local church officials' actions during the war were documented. When historians requested access to those diocesan archives to verify or challenge the Vatican's claims, they found that access policies varied enormously. Some dioceses were open and cooperative, others restrictive, and some simply claimed that relevant materials had been destroyed during the war or lost in subsequent decades. The result was that the historical debate about Pius XV and the Holocaust continued to be based on incomplete evidence, with the Vatican citing materials it had access to, and critics citing materials from other repositories, and no comprehensive account possible because no one could access everything. This isn't unique to Holocaust history. It's a structural feature of how Catholic Church archives operate: dispersed authority, inconsistent access, no central inventory. And that structure serves institutional interests by making it nearly impossible to construct a definitive historical narrative that the Church hasn't approved. Because there's always another archive that hasn't been consulted, always another set of materials that might change the picture. The Galileo letter in this context is just one example of a much broader phenomenon. Documents that exist somewhere in the Catholic archival system that are referenced in other materials, but that can't be definitively located because the system isn't designed to make comprehensive research possible. Whether this is an unfortunate byproduct of the Church's organizational structure or a deliberate strategy for managing historical controversy is something historians will continue to debate, but the practical effect is the same. Large portions of Catholic history remain unknowable, not because the documents don't exist, but because the system makes them unfindable. The institutional mechanism that perpetuates this is simple. No one has the authority to mandate universal access policies across all Catholic archives. The Vatican can control its own archives. Religious orders can control theirs, and dioceses can control theirs. And while there are informal norms and occasional agreements to coordinate, there's no enforcement mechanism and no external oversight. This means that even if the Vatican wanted to open everything in its possession, and it doesn't, but even if it did, that wouldn't give researchers access to materials held by other parts of the Church. And because those other institutions have their own reasons for restricting access, their own sensitive histories to manage, their own institutional interests to protect, the overall picture remains fragmented and will likely stay that way indefinitely. The consequence for understanding history, and specifically for understanding something like why one letter from Galileo is missing from the accessible record, is that you have to accept incompleteness as a permanent condition. You can't ever say with certainty that you found everything relevant, because the system guarantees that you haven't. The best you can do is document what you can access, note the gaps, and acknowledge that future researchers might fill in some of those gaps if access policies change, if new materials are discovered, if someone with insider knowledge decides to leak information. But the system as a whole, the dispersed, fragmented, partially restricted archival landscape of the Catholic Church, isn't going to suddenly become transparent. It wasn't designed to be transparent. It was designed to serve an institution that has existed for 2 millennia and that thinks about historical legacy in terms of centuries rather than decades. From that perspective, keeping a letter from Galileo out of circulation for a few hundred years isn't a crisis. It's just prudent management of a complicated narrative. Waiting until the moment when revealing the full story serves institutional interests rather than complicating them. And that moment might come, or it might not. But either way, the system will continue functioning as it has, preserving some things, restricting others, and slowly shaping historical memory through the careful control of what gets cataloged, what gets accessed, and what stays missing from the inventory list. You've come to the end of this now, to the place where understanding accumulates into something you can't unknow. The secret isn't that documents are destroyed or that conspiracies actively hide the truth. The secret is that institutional memory operates through systems that are designed to protect the institution first and serve historical truth only when the two align. The missing item from the Vatican inventory list, that letter from Galileo offering to recant before his trial even began, represents a particular kind of absence, one that's more common than most people realize. It's not that the letter was deemed dangerous enough to destroy. It's that it was deemed complicated enough to set aside, to file in a location that wasn't prioritized for cataloging, to transfer during a reorganization without carefully tracking where it went, to leave in a category marked pending restoration or awaiting processing indefinitely. The system doesn't need villains to function this way. It just needs bureaucratic inertia, limited resources, and a consistent principle that some materials matter more than others when it comes to allocating archival staff time. The Sala degli Indici, that index room we talked about earlier, contains finding aids for the materials that have been made accessible. But there's no equivalent room containing a comprehensive index of what hasn't been made accessible, what's still sitting in the deposito non ordinato, what was transferred to reserved collections during the 1969 reorganization, what exists in Jesuit or Dominican or Franciscan archives that were never transferred to the Vatican. That absence of a negative index, a catalog of what's not cataloged, is itself revealing. It means the system is designed to work with what's available, rather than to systematically track what's missing. And that design choice reflects a view of history as something to be managed rather than discovered, curated rather than comprehensively preserved. The physical spaces we've discussed, the Cortile del Belvedere with its climate-controlled rooms, the basement deposito non ordinato with its industrial shelving, the Sala degli Indici with its mix of handwritten ledgers and digital terminals. These aren't secret locations. They're ordinary institutional spaces doing ordinary institutional work. But the accumulation of ordinary decisions over centuries creates an extraordinary result, a historical record that presents itself as comprehensive while remaining fundamentally incomplete. and that incompleteness serves the institution by keeping certain narratives flexible, certain questions unresolved, certain complications postponed to a future generation of historians who might approach them under different political or theological circumstances. The cataloging rules we've examined, the rispetto del fondo principle, the priorità documentaria system, the classification of materials as aperta, riservata, or segreta, these aren't innovations of the Vatican. They're adaptations of standard archival practices developed across Europe in the 19th and 20th centuries. What's distinctive is how consistently they've been applied to serve institutional interests over historical transparency, and how the Vatican's unique position as both a religious authority and a sovereign state gives it the power to maintain those restrictions without external accountability. When Benedict XVI opened materials up to 1939 in 2006, when Francis opened Pius XV materials in 2020, these weren't acts of pure transparency. They were calculated decisions that enough time had passed, enough participants in those events had died, enough political circumstances had changed, that revealing those materials would do more good for the Church's reputation than harm. And even then, only the already catalogued materials were opened. The backlog remained and continues to grow. The institutional mechanism of the prefect of the Apostolic Archives, with final authority over access and no external oversight, ensures that this pattern will continue. Future openings will happen when the Church decides they serve institutional interests, not when historians decide enough time has passed or when public pressure demands transparency. And each opening will reset the conversation, generate headlines about Vatican openness, and shift attention away from what remains closed. Some historians quietly disagree about whether this represents a sustainable approach to managing institutional history in an era of increasing demands for transparency and accountability. The Church has survived 2,000 years by adapting slowly, by outlasting critics, by operating on timescales that exceed individual lifetimes. From that perspective, keeping materials restricted for decades or centuries is entirely reasonable. It's just the short term as the institution understands it. But the digital age has changed expectations about access to information, and younger generations of scholars are less willing to accept bureaucratic delays as inevitable. Whether that pressure will eventually force structural changes in how Catholic archives operate, or whether the Church will successfully maintain its traditional approach to managing its historical record, remains to be seen. The consequence of all this, the thing you should take away from understanding how the system actually works, is that absence is itself a form of information. When a document is referenced in other materials but can't be located in any accessible archive, that tells you something about institutional priorities. When inventories show gaps or transfers without destinations, that tells you something about what gets preserved and what gets set aside. When access requests are denied with procedural justifications that never quite resolve, that tells you something about what topics remain sensitive decades or centuries after the events occurred. The Galileo letter, whether it exists in some uncatalogued box in the Vatican's basement or in a Jesuit archive somewhere, or was lost during one of the many reorganizations and transfers over 4 centuries, represents all the other documents that share its status. Present in the historical record as references and citations, but absent from the accessible archive. And those absences shape historical understanding just as much as the presences do, maybe more, because they define the boundaries of what can be known with certainty versus what remains speculation and debate. You came here tonight, to this story, maybe looking for a mystery solved, a secret revealed, a clear answer about what happened to one letter from one scientist in one trial 400 years ago. But what you've found instead is something more valuable and more unsettling, an understanding of how institutions maintain power through the management of memory, how systems designed to preserve information can be used to control it, and how the gaps in the historical record aren't accidents, but features of a structure that's been refined over centuries to serve those who maintain it. That understanding doesn't give you the satisfaction of a solved mystery, but it gives you something better, the ability to read institutional history critically, to recognize when absence means something, to understand that what's missing from an inventory list is often more significant than what's included. And if you found this useful, if it gave you a way of thinking about archives and history and institutional power that you didn't have before, then maybe you'd like to see what else this channel offers. We share new stories like this every day, stories that take you past the surface of historical events into the mechanisms underneath, the systems and structures and decisions that shape what gets remembered and what gets quietly set aside. If that's valuable to you, go ahead and hit that like button, let the algorithm know this kind of content matters, and subscribe if you haven't already, because there's more here than you'll get through in one night. But don't feel rushed. The stories aren't going anywhere. They'll be here when you need them, whenever you're ready to understand how the past actually works instead of just what we're told about it. For now, though, rest. You've traveled far enough tonight.